So, a while back, nearly a year now, I made a video on Ryu vs Kashimo. Now, while I still agree with Ryu likely being above base Kashimo, and I agree with a lot of my Ryu scaling I did at the time, my scaling for Kashimo was inadequate, and I feel currently as though he could be placed as high as maybe even the top 5 to 6. I still don't agree with the Kashimo Glazers. No, Kashimo isn't in the top 2 to 3, nor will I ever associate with that part of the community. This video is merely an attempt at finding common ground, using significantly better arguments and accurately expressing where Kashimo should be, based on feats, statements, and a narrative. First of all, I think I owe everyone an explanation as to my thoughts on the Hikari being equal to Yuta agenda, which I've always disagreed with, and is a key reason as to why I don't believe Kashimo to be in the top 3. The only two real statements for Hikari being equal to or above Yuta are from Yuta himself, and maybe an implication from Gojo placing them on a similar footing. The other two statements that imply this are literally just in reference to Yuta's statement, and as such, they share the same context, so debunking or reinterpreting the source claim would in turn apply to them. To start with Yuta's statement, even excluding Maki's follow-up disregarding what Yuta said, I think there are multiple problems with this statement, especially in context of the series. For one, Yuta has self-confidence issues and generally underestimates himself, this being directly stated. Not only is this in character with his dynamic with Maki, but it's also blatantly stated at the end of a chapter in the Sendai Colony fight. This alone doesn't necessarily make it unusable, but I think a reinterpretation more in line with what the series portrays does allow us to more accurately gauge how Hikari scales to Yuta. The statement specifically mentions that when Hikari is on a roll, he may be superior to Yuta. What's the definition of on a roll, though? Well, according to Oxford, which will be my source of definitions here, on a roll insinuates a prolonged amount of success or luck. Now, looking at in context of Hikari, this would evidently be in reference to multiple jackpots being hit consecutively. For a moment, let's take our attention away from Hikari with that in mind, and look at Yuta during Sendai Colony. Yuta's Sendai Colony fights are what I'll be using, but for Yuta, he fights temporarily without the ring. At best, let's equate that to maybe 5 minutes, which is generous considering as far as we were shown, the ring lasted longer than Yuta does without it. But with that in mind, and the small bit that Yuta did after the ring ran out when he was fighting Ryu, Yuta fought for maybe 11 minutes. This means, at best, Yuta can fight for 16 minutes consecutively at this point in time, before running out of energy. Now, with Hikari being on a roll implying multiple jackpots, Hikari hitting 4 jackpots in a row would immediately make him outlast Yuta's maximum duration with ease. This ties into my interpretation in how Hikari is used in the series, as this statement primarily just means that Hikari can maintain his full power for extended periods of time, longer than Yuta, which means that when Hikari is still going strong at full power, Yuta is drained and bottoming out, which then means Hikari is superior in longer encounters. Not necessarily that he's physically superior or stronger overall, as that's not what the full statement entails. Under Oxford's first definition of what it means to be strong per se, it provides the context of possessing skills and qualities that create a likelihood of success, and able to perform a specified action well and powerfully. So this interpretation is perfectly fine. Hikari being stronger on a roll than Yuta just means that under the circumstance of landing multiple jackpots, he's more ideal for drawn-out fights, and his arsenal actively thrives in that situation. Now, as for the Gojo statement, I think a similar argument can be made. The Gojo statement is, as shown, stating that Gojo only wants anyone to join the fight if he gets weaker than a Kotsu or Kinji. But what people fail to take into account is that Yuta contextualizes this by saying that Gojo's statement was circumstantial, and that Yuta himself would be more ideal at taking care of the Shikigami Sukuna summoned. This very clearly demonstrates that the statement Gojo made is based on the situation and their effectiveness during it. The statement would only mean that if Gojo becomes less effective for the situation than Yuta, then Yuta could join in, and that if he got less effective than Hikari at the given circumstance, then Hikari could join in. I genuinely don't see why it's hard to understand for some people that Yuta and Hikari have different kits that are optimized for different combat scenarios, especially in the way Hikari's fights are portrayed, in which he's generally portrayed as the physically inferior combatant of himself and the opponent, and simply wins or stalemates, through stalling and outlasting his opponent. No, I'm not saying Hikari can't scale to Yuta in any way. I'm simply saying these arguments based on the two statements just aren't good. Listen to me, Kashimo fans, please. Learn to use new arguments, like any other person does when their character gets debunked. Hell, I'm literally doing it for you at this point through the video. There's a refusal to change and grow, which leads to Kashimo himself being poorly represented. But with that out of the way, I've spent long enough on debunking. Let's get into actually scaling Kashimo properly now. First off, how does Kashimo actually scale in base? You can get him decently high actually. Using my interpretations of the earlier statements, Hikari can still at least damage a fatigued Yuta to a decent degree, which I do think portrays a low level of relativity at the very least, which can be backed up by Urame. Urame has statements of being a monster to deal with, even with Sukuna and Kenjaku gone. Urame having Sukuna's respect, so it's generally narratively consistent that Urame is a strong combatant, especially considering she has feats on a fully realized Maki, having held her in place for a significant amount of time. It was also fast enough to scale to Maki speed-wise, considering Maki has precog and had time to react. While I wouldn't say it blitzed Maki, it certainly at least implies a somewhat similar level of speed. Hikari is able to damage this Urame, and likely scales to an extent in speed, so Hikari scales to a likely Maki level fighter and can at least somewhat damage and keep up with Sendai Yuta. Base Kashimo just upscales this by a decent degree. Kashimo could consistently outperform Hikari during their encounter for nearly the entire length of the fight, tearing through him like butter and nearly killing this seemingly immortal gambler multiple times. Kashimo also, when first confronting Sukuna, attacks him in base, in which he's able to knock Sukuna's hand away when Sukuna blocks with Kamutoke. Furthermore, you can even argue Kashimo might scale to Kenjaku to a relatively slim degree. Kashimo back in the Edo period is pretty much blatantly implied above the same Kenjaku at the time, in which Kenjaku should have most of the same arsenal as the modern era, aside from Kaori/Geto's curse techniques and Geto's physical stats. So it wouldn't necessarily mean he's above current Kenjaku. Base Kashimo should, at least to an extent, scale to Kenjaku. Another thing worthy of note is that when struck with Kamutoke, which should exceed Sukuna's standard output due to being his special grade curse tool, which, if it didn't, he has no reason to really be using it, Kashimo was nearly unfazed. But why does this matter? Well, even though it was stated it was his cursed energy trait that assisted him in that, we see a similar circumstance with Satoru Gojo, in which it did less damage due to it being his own cursed energy, in which he still took more damage from the unlimited hollow than Kashimo did Kamutoke. This just implies Kashimo blatantly scales to Sukuna's Kamutoke output, even with a cursed tool in play at this point, closer than Satoru Gojo does to his unlimited hollow at that point. And this Meguna's output shouldn't be any lower than his true form self throughout the raid. I think all of this pretty consistently has Kashimo at least around Maki in overall narrative, statements, and feats, and pretty much all physical stats. Now, Mythical Beast Amber is where Kashimo gets to these top tiers, as I said earlier, around at least the top 5. Kashimo was consistently shown above the Meguna he fights to a pretty significant degree, being one of the rare fights where Sukuna actually dodges and appears concerned. And while most people disregard it, I think disregarding this is kind of stupid. Meguna wasn't like completely crippled and dying or anything. He was missing a hand and had some bruises and scorch marks. That is all. All the debris and blood on him was literally shown to be pretty much surface level when Urame's melted ice washed it away and he appeared for the most part fine afterwards. Is Meguna even remotely full power like he was against Gojo? Of course not. But is he blatantly scaled the output of his true form self that we see afterwards? Yes. The transformation only affected his physiology, it didn't drastically change his output. So Kashimo is blatantly above the Meguna from after the Gojo fight. It has equivalent output to the true form Sukuna afterwards in terms of things such as dismantle, cleave, etc. Kashimo in this form even portrays very high-end relativity to the true form Sukuna he faces as well, at least in comparison to everyone else for the most part. He's still shown tanking punches pretty casually, shows the ability to consistently react to Sukuna physically, can react to the world-cutting dismantle, and narratively is just on a very high level. Kashimo, agility-wise and in overall speed, is actually really impressive. Being able to even just mostly dodge dismantle is a phenomenal feat, considering it is a chanted dismantle while he was mid-air and he barely got tagged by it. I'd argue this is the best feat reaction-wise to Sukuna's dismantles, aside from Gojo and like Kusakabe's auto-react within the simple domain. Maki and Yuta consistently get hit by dismantle nearly every time, and Maki only dodges a similarly charged dismantle due to precognition, and being able to actually see and perceive the slash, which we know from Sukuna's statement, considering we're on a similar level to Mahoraga in that aspect, that Kashimo can't. So that just enunciates that Kashimo's feat was superior. Kashimo also later reacts when Sukuna attempts to blitz him, which he performs significantly better than Maki in that regard. During the fight with Maki, Sukuna blitzes her near the end by dashing across the entire room and grabbing her by the face, yanking her outside. I'll even steelman the slight possibility that her vision was obscured, even though that's hardly an adequate response. Kashimo had a significantly worse situation and still reacted far better. In Maki's case, you can argue that her vision was somewhat obscured for some of the distance Sukuna traveled through the block being in the way, but Kashimo had his vision blocked by a lightning strike, and that's way worse taking into account how Kashimo's vision works. Kashimo's vision is based on X-rays in Mythical Beast Amber, meaning his vision is primarily based on radiation and his actual sight uses electromagnetic waves. Lightning very blatantly emits a large array of electromagnetic waves and radiation. You see where I'm going here? Sukuna basically put this dude into sensory overload by blasting with lightning, while also having the obvious blast blocking Kashimo's vision. But unlike Maki, who didn't react whatsoever physically, Kashimo is able to track and react to the stronger Sukuna under these worse circumstances. This just shows he is blatantly much faster than Maki, simply based off this. I also think there's a large basis of consistency for Sukuna taking Kashimo more seriously than he did fighters like Maki, for example. Not only did Sukuna treat Kashimo with respect and dignity as the strongest of his era even after killing him, but Sukuna should be aware of at least Yuta's strength during the early Culling games through having seen him through Yuji. This, as well as having killed Ryu, him genuinely respecting Kashimo and treating him as the strongest is just establishing a narrative that should already be present that Kashimo stands among the strongest in the verse. Another reason I believe Sukuna to be taking this fight at least pretty seriously or is excited enough to be near his current full power is this statement. I know at first glance you're wondering, like, why I'd be using this statement saying his curse energy is beginning to waver because he's not interested. But the implications are actually really solid. Well, this implies that Sukuna is only now beginning to be disinterested or not as excited per se, which is consistent with the fact that Sukuna tells Kashimo not to ruin this for him as he was still hyped up from the Gojo fight. Kashimo fights likely the strongest Sukuna out of anyone during the raid aside from Gojo and maybe Yuji near the end when Sukuna becomes nearly fully restored, and he still has by far one of the best performances easily. Do I think Kashimo is in the top 3 and beats everyone not named Sukuna or Gojo? No, I don't particularly subscribe to that meta, but I can see the argument using a lot of this completely overlooked shit that Kashimo fans skim over in favor of a couple of caveman statements that at absolute best can be argued for the sake of consistency. Kashimo is probably up there as top probably 5 for me, so significantly higher than a lot of down players think, or how I used to think. But he's not quite as strong as what Kashimo fans try to portray, even arguing him to be near Gojo level in stats, which I don't see whatsoever. But I genuinely hope Kashimo fans can actually rep their character better and more accurately, considering he is a really cool character. But until next time, hopefully within like the next 4 days, I'll see you all again. Peace.